Transgender, like queer, functions as an umbrella term that can be capacious and flexible. It has the capacity to unify formerly marginalized concepts, cultures, and groups. Though I understand that this flexibility in terminology and theory can threaten to dilute its power, I'm choosing to deploy this broader approach to trans in order to globally harness its political and theoretical implications. Most trans scholarship identifies trans as a concept that disrupts a binary gendered system, as does the concept queer, yet specifically emphasizes gender as potentially porous and permeable spatial territories. While the term queer opened up a wider space for sexual non-normativity, trans captures a range of gendered embodiments, practices, and movements. I am especially interested in exploring trans elements such as gender nonconformity for the purposes of movement building, in Enk's terms, which emphasize trans as significant cross-gender identification, and trans as non-intelligible and non-incorporated, as in Jack Halberstam's terms. Should these rifts exist? Should trans be relegated to the non-human, unintelligible? Patricia Elliott asks in Debates in Transgender, Queer, and Feminist Theory, should the category of the human be transformed, or should the unintelligible be celebrated for their potential to oppose the status quo? In their introduction, Trans, or Transgender, Susan Stryker, Paisley Curra, and Lisa Jean Moore invoke an additional concept of trans- to designate categorical crossings, leakages, and slips of all sorts. In Undoing Gender, Judith Butler recognized at an early stage of trans theory that trans denotes a mode of passage, and that the transgender position is interstitial and transitional, not reducible to male to female or female to male transitions. All of these trans concepts inform my approach, which emphasizes Gothic cultural productions as destabilizing, crossing, and unfixed. Trans-Gothic can be seen as a critical deployment of trans movements. A perpetual occupation of Gothic spaces and haunts, it simultaneously territorializes and deterritorializes Gothic space. This collection's chapters approach several aims in transing the Gothic. Many of its authors engage with ideas about the body and gender identification that support a reading of subjectivity that embraces fluidity and non-conforming gender positions. Like queering, transing can also help explain why the Gothic, since its inception, has been a persistent venue for transgressive and non-normative sexualities and gender identities. While we can agree that the Gothic novel contributed to the distribution of modern subject formation, we can also agree with Haggerty that it became the testing ground for many unauthorized genders and sexualities. By acknowledging and illuminating the presence of gender variance in this history, a trans-Gothic approach partially closes the gap that Haggerty's Queer Gothic opened with its exploration of a trans-historical homosexuality. This approach can also help us mark the persistent appropriation of trans bodies throughout the history of Gothic literature and film. And in a broader context, discussions in this collection, such as Jeremy Chow's, Jason Whitaker's, and Hannah Priest's, offer productive readings of the Gothic as hybrid transmodality, highlighting its transgeneric qualities. Employing the trans marker helps us locate narrative and visual intersections, overlaps, and reconstructions as we continue exploring Gothic's non-normative function. By bringing together various viewpoints and historical contexts, trans-Gothic in literature and culture contributes to an emerging field of study and provides new perspectives on the ways in which Gothic literature, visual media, and other cultural forms explicitly engage sexuality and gender. Trans-Gothic not only provides part of the needed discussion of the relation between sexuality, gender, and trans theories and studies, but it is a forum in which the ideas of several well-respected critics converge, producing a breadth of knowledge and a diversity of perspectives and methodologies previously unseen. Trans-Gothic gender. The collection commences with a grouping of chapters that explore the variances of gender identification in 18th, 1700s, and 19th century, 1800s, Gothic fiction. All of the chapters in this section explore homoeroticism, gender-variant characters, non-conforming materiality, and diverse interpretations of proto-trans identities. And beyond Queer Gothic, charting the Gothic history of the trans subject in Beckford, Lewis, Byron, Noel Marshall recognizes that recent studies of the Gothic have moved beyond an initial focus on femininity to consider broader questions regarding gender and sexuality. George Haggerty, for instance, has argued that Gothic texts evoke a queer worldview. The question remains, though, what enabled Gothic authors to evoke this worldview in a culture where same-sex eroticism was considered unspeakable and punishable by censorship, pillory, and occasionally hanging? This question is further complicated by critical consensus that, despite its invocation of transgressive practices, Gothic is a genre that routinely punishes the very gendered and sexual transgressions that it catalogs. Building on J. Prosser's argument in Second Skins that queer desire is often expressed through transgender imagery, Marshall's chapter identifies a strain of male Gothic writing that created a queer worldview by strategically appropriating the transgender body. The chapter theorizes transtextuality as a narrative strategy whereby authors transitioned characters from one sex to another to safely evoke same-sex desire. As a prefix meaning across, beyond, or through, trans in combination with textuality suggests transitions in gender or sex across a text or versions of a text, performances of gender that pushed beyond social norms, and changes in gendered or sexed signification that occur through a variety of authorial narrative techniques that challenge traditional ways of reading the body as a text. To outline the strain of male Gothic, Marshall analyzes Kenneth W. Graham's edition of Beckford's Vathic, which contains both the same-sex version of the tale, The History of Prince Aisley and Prince Firuz, and the version of the tale first published as The History of Prince Alassi and Princess Firuzkaz. He argues that Beckford's authorial decision to discursively transition Firuz from a male body to a female body and represent transgender rather than same-sex eroticism in his second, more mainstream version of the tale indicates his recognition that strategic deployment of transgender imagery could facilitate a queer worldview while avoiding further problems in the wake of Beckford's own personal scandal. Marshall also discusses the role of transtextuality in The Monk and Lara. Like Beckford, Lewis's and Byron's authorial decisions to transition their characters allowed them to evoke a queer worldview through transgender imagery, while simultaneously avoiding many of the disciplinary mechanisms surrounding same-sex desire. Marshall concludes that unlike Beckford and Lewis, however, Byron's depiction of transgender characters is more progressive. Building upon Marshall's interpretation of Vathic, transtextuality, and how the proto-trans body is depicted in Gothic narrative, Chapter 2, Jeremy Chow's Go to Hell, William Beckford's Skewed Heaven and Hell, provides an illuminating discussion of Beckford and the episodes. As Chow outlines, the episodes meant to follow the tribulations of Vathic and his peers in Eblis, understood as hell, and were not published, against Beckford's wishes, until the early 20th century, 1900s. Thus, the episodes have received less attention and focus than the eponymous Vathic, and yet, as both Marshall and Chow attest, they rival the larger narrative in both imaginative, seedy plot and sheer length. Beckford's first episode, The History of the Two Princes and Friends, Alazia and Firuzka, features a fantastical gender-bending princess hell-bent on fomenting pain, anguish, and unapologetic chaos. Firuz, in the initial publication of the episodes, is male, but Beckford's original intent was to reveal Firuz as cross-dressing, Firuzka. Acknowledging Marshall's argument, Chow demonstrates how important it is for readers to consider the plural transgender that Beckford's Firuzka assumes. Through this investigation, Chow identifies an important causation in two parts. First, the ambiguous Firuzka narrative and publication history reminds us of the porous, penetrable, and perpetual interchangeability of bodies. And second, the result of this mutability cements Firuzka's entrapment in Eblis hell. Ultimately, Chow's reading identifies that the trans body, as demonstrated by Firuzka, is both vilified and empowered through the inversion of a powerful elite hell. Chapter 3 also works with Gothic narrative and its challenge to the dominant heteronormative perspective. My own contribution, Trans-Gothic Desire in Charlotte Dacre's Zofloya, demonstrates how Charlotte Dacre's Zofloya explores the Gothic fascination with the unknown, responding to the limits of reason. While Marshall and Chow's chapters reconfigure male Gothic, the aim of my chapter is to trouble the ways in which the female Gothic depicts the mystery of and anxieties about gender and sexuality. Specifically, I argue that anxieties about a post-Enlightenment sexuality and shifting gender norms are often represented by sexual desires and acts that deviate from cultural norms and transgress taboos. Reading the Gothic novel as a disruption of female and male Gothic formations, as a trans genre that embodies explorations of transgender, I highlight that Dacre's Victoria di Loredani is a transitioning figure, and Zofloya, straddling Enlightenment and Romantic Gothic, transgresses limits of desire in response to the transformation of sex into modern discourse. While the fragmented form of the Gothic narrative represents the breakdown of social order and status quo, Gothic bodies also disrupt stable notions of what it is to be human. Part of this is how to be human. The Gothic body's transgressive sexual acts, such as incest, are played out in order for heteronormative sexuality to be restored in the end. Zofloya is no different in this, but unlike previous queer interpretations of this novel, my chapter recognizes Dacre's depictions of the polymorphous, transformative body, one that we later see in Gothic non-human bodies such as the vampire. I suggest that Victoria's characterization pushes boundaries beyond the interracial or nymphomaniac. Her discursive and physical performance dismantles stereotypes and redefines the female self. The novel offers a female subjectivity that moves toward the masculine without offering any opportunity for reversal or permanent integration. Victoria's transition creates a new subjective space, though at the cost of her sexuality and eventually her life. As the chapter outlines, drugs and potions may temporarily transform the masculinized Victoria back into a feminine ideal, allowing her to perform gender, but by the novel's end, her transition is complete and irreversible, inscribing a unique and indelible trans-Gothic portrait. Ardell Haffel-Thomas's Chapter 4 further explores the alignment of the transgender body with the Gothic monster, that dreadful thing that looked like a beautiful girl, trans anxiety, trans possibility in 3 late Victorian werewolf tales, focuses on Rudyard Kipling's The Mark of the Beast, 1890, Clemens Hausmann's The Werewolf, 1890, and Eric Stenbach's The Other Side, A Breton Legend, 1893. In each of the stories, the author has chosen to set the action outside of 19th century Britain, and in one case, in another country and another century. However, the issues plaguing fin de siècle culture continue to pervade each tale. In fact, colonial anxieties can be found to populate in the Gothic monster, and as Thomas finds, these descriptions are tinged with trans possibilities. Kipling's The Mark of the Beast is a fantastically Orientalist story set in India. In the homosocial world of Englishmen in India coming together for an evening out full of camaraderie and drinking, it all ends badly when one of them is so grossly drunk that he defiles a statue of Hanuman, a monkey with supernatural powers, only to have an ancient leper curse him. What ensues is an odd tale of bestial transformations that not only calls everyone's nationalist ideals into question. Hausmann, a social advocate and suffragist, chose to set her werewolf story in frozen medieval Scandinavia. Her werewolf, quite the opposite of Kipling's, is a woman with the stature and strength of a man. Whilst Hausmann certainly upholds the stereotype of the monstrous woman as werewolf, a sort of femme fatale, her most interesting critique about gender roles and gender transgressions lies with her look at the twin brothers Swayan and Christian. Through the literal migrations over the frozen landscape, Hausmann forces the reader to rethink stereotypes of masculinity. Ultimately, Christian is Christ-like in his sacrifice to save his hypermasculine brother. Thomas argues that underneath this tale, Hausmann interrogates various Victorian notions of so-called muscular Christianity. The chapter concludes with a provocative reading of Steinbach's The Other Side, A Breton Legend, which, in its descriptions of an eroticized female werewolf, intersects sexuality, bestiality, and transanimality. Haffel-Thomas maintains that this tale, even more so than Kipling's or Hausmann's, underscores the constant shift, or migrations, of the boundaries between locations, genders, and species. Trans-Gothic bodies. These analyses of supernatural, demonic, and monstrous trans-Gothic characters are followed by a section that further explores the implications of the non-normative body in Gothic literature and culture. Harlan Weaver's Monster Trans, Diffracting Affect, Reading Rage, cogently reacts to and extends Susan Stryker's intention in My Words to Victor Frankenstein. As Weaver brilliantly outlines, textured by rage and tempered by writing, the relationship between Stryker's transsexual monstrosity and Victor Frankenstein's monster produces a uniquely queer fury, that reaches kraken-like into the space of reading. Moving with the sticky suction of cephalopod limbs, this affect seeks to shape with its touch, to convey change through feeling, so that reading the written word becomes an encounter that transforms. Weaver compellingly traces the movements of this affect and the changes it conveys in thinking through the relationship between Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Susan Stryker's My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, performing transgender rage. Unlike other readers of Frankenstein, Weaver does not address the questions posed by the novel's enigmatic form, nor does he outline the ways that Stryker directly reflects Shelley's monster. Rather, Weaver's reading focuses on the interplay between the texts, or what he terms the diffraction patterns that emerge between them. Uniquely, Weaver's chapter takes up Donna Haraway's definition of diffraction as an optical metaphor for the effort to make a difference in the world, a means to see and better understand difference over sameness. This is intersected with Karen Barad's material explanation of the physics diffraction produces. Describing an experimental apparatus in which a screen with multiple slits is placed upright and light is shown through the slits onto a second screen, Barad notes that, instead of slit-sized spots of light, what one sees on the second screen is a diffraction or interference pattern. In this setup, light acts as a wave, and the diffraction patterns mapped onto the second screen reveal points where the waves engendered by movement through the slit screens are augmented, overlapping and becoming larger than before, and diminished, canceling each other out where a peak meets a trough. This chapter then takes up diffraction by reading how Shelley's and Stryker's texts, already in close proximity to each other, act as slits for the monstrous anger and intense feelings that move, wave-like, through both of them. By tracing the patterns produced by the movement of these feelings through these texts, Weaver identifies points of constructive interference that demarcate the emergence of differences between them. In this sense, the chapter compares the texts and reading them through their proximity, doing so in order to examine the changes produced by the emotions that move through and shape them. Centered in questions of gender, monstrosity, humanity, kinship, and language, these changes, or nodes of diffraction, are of considerable relevance to scholars of both soma technics and transgender studies. Weaver's theoretical engagement with optics and diffraction seamlessly intersects with Part 2's next two chapters on Gothic film, which return to Marshall's earlier discussion of Prosser's transgender skin theory. First, April Miller's More Than Skin Deep, Aliens, Fembots, and Transmonstrosities in Techno-Gothic Space explores gender fluidity and the monstrous body at the center of science fiction film. As a mode marked by boundary crossing and transgression, the Gothic offers up landscapes and bodies that are decidedly alien in their ability to resist neat categorization and queer in their defiance of gendered social norms. Just as 18th century, 1700s Gothic literature provided a shadowy counterpoint to Enlightenment rationalism, science fiction films often contest the contemporary utopian vision of technological progress, perhaps most vividly when they address the transhumanist desire to transcend the limits of human intellectual and physical abilities and the often monstrous results of such experimentation. As such, Miller's chapter analyzes Gothic modalities, subjectivities, and spaces in two contemporary transhumanist science fiction films that place gender transgressive subjects at their center, Jonathan Glazer's Under the Skin and Alex Garland's Ex Machina. These films explore humanity's innate fear of its own organic vulnerability and the brevity of human life by presenting violent confrontations between fleshy and fragile humans, invasive and mutable humanoids, and seemingly invulnerable techno-bodies. The chapter first takes up Glazer's film, a loose adaptation of Michael Faber's novel of the same name, which presents Scarlett Johansson as a protagonist who embodies the transgressive qualities of the Gothic subject, a nameless, sexless alien serial killer who wears a synthetic female skin that allows her to travel the Scottish countryside in search of male transients and hitchhikers who provide the meat she needs to survive. Donning an array of synthetically produced body parts, Johansson's predatory alien links gender nonconformity with the transhuman desire to defy bodily limitations, while also reifying cultural assumptions about the feminine and the female body. Similarly, the film's visual landscape epitomizes the kind of dreadful Gothic space defined by Judith Wilt, an unpredictable wasteland that highlights human defenselessness against both technological and natural environments. Next, the chapter examines Under the Skin, in which Gothic space is represented by both the alien's beautifully corrosive and viscous killing pool and the barren highlands she uses as her hunting ground. Initially invulnerable and incapable of empathy, most markedly when she abandons a toddler on the shore of a stormy beach, the trans protagonist of Under the Skin problematizes binary opposition of human and non-human, as the alien's growing empathy for her victims leaves her increasingly susceptible to physical and sexual violation. Miller maintains that with its Gothic structure, Ex Machina demonstrates a similar commitment to transgressive spaces and subjects. Like Glazer's film, Ex Machina questions the boundaries of the body and definitions of humanness. Through a provocative reading of Skin, Miller considers how both films invoke and challenge the objectification of the female subject, reminding male characters and viewers that the transhumanist subject's body is nothing more than a carapace, a deceptive exterior that can be manipulated or discarded at will. In scrutinizing the Gothic roots and monstrous transhuman subjects at the center of these films, Miller considers how scientifically enhanced bodies, created by human and alien manipulations of corporeality, can muddy long-standing binary distinctions and ultimately redefine what it means to be human and transhuman.